U.S. government agencies are taking concerted steps to implement a zero trust architecture to protect critical systems and data. Those efforts include meeting a number of cybersecurity standards and objectives by the end of fiscal year 2024. I'm Wyatt Cash with Scoop News Group, and here to talk about that effort at the Department of Energy is Amy Hamilton, the department's Senior Cybersecurity Advisor for Policy and Programs. Amy, thank you so much for joining us. And let me ask you to start by give us a brief overview of the Department of Energy's portfolio of responsibilities and the IT operations that support them.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Wyatt, for having me here today. And when I look at the Department of Energy's portfolio, it is very, very nuanced. And so we do have a nuclear portfolio. We have the National Nuclear Security Agency, who falls in our portfolio, as well as environmental management. And what that really has to do a lot with is nuclear cleanup that people might not be aware of. And so this is a very intensive physical systems and operational technology portfolio. And, this is obviously a no-fail mission. In addition to that, we have the Power Marketing Administrations. The PMAs are responsible for power, primarily along the West Coast. Super important mission as well. And of course, we have our open science technology. Things like the Human Genome Project has come out of what we're doing here at the Department of Energy. So these very nuanced missions, we have very different requirements for it. And so we have to balance the cybersecurity and our risk management based on what those missions are.
Well, I'm curious then, how do you prioritize and what are your top priorities in the next year, maybe in the short term and maybe over the next 3 years to meet the federal zero trust security requirements?
So I'm going to go a little bit broader than just zero trust, because I think it's super important to understand Executive Order 14028 for strengthening, the nation's cybersecurity, and where zero trust is a very significant part of that portfolio. And so what we did at the Department of Energy is we built it into a business case to try to get our mission owners to really understand what this means. So the first part of this for the mission owners is understanding that multi-factor authentication that's phishing resistant is a really important way to protect our identities, and that passwords are just not cutting it anymore. And the other thing to that is that point in the executive order, which is encrypting data to the maximum extent possible. Both MFA and encryption are part of zero trust, but we've really prioritized those as the most important thing, because then if an adversary is able to obtain that data, if you have phishing resistant credentials and it's encrypted, it's very, very unlikely that they're going to be able to decrypt that data. So that's our number one priority. The number two thing to that is zero trust and cloud adoption, and really moving down that environment. I know we're going to be talking a bit more detail in the pillars and the steps later on, so I'm going to save that. But we really said, okay, that's the intermediary step. But the part that's super, super important is this partnership that we have to have with industry, and that's the supply chain. And we absolutely have to know where that fits into it. So we really are taking it from that, three-step approach, and then continuously we have to do our monitoring for vulnerabilities and reacting as we're aware of new threats. For instance, the geopolitical landscape this year, I think there's been a lot of surprises for all of us.
Well, one of the common issues we do hear from federal agencies is how to implement zero trust principles across multiple networks and domains and functional silos. How are you trying to reduce the complications of that at the Department of Energy?
So one of the first approaches we took at the Department of Energy is we developed our ZTA plan as a department. It was very much like a strategy back in July of 2021. And from there, we went to our departmental elements, which includes the national laboratories, and said in 1 year, we need you to have your individual sites with a plan. And so we've been very, very successful in that step approach, with the headquarters doing it first and then the sites. The other thing that we started to do is what we realized when we looked at our headquarters plan is there was a really, really great plan, but it just focused on each individual pillar. So what we decided to do was what's called tabletop exercises. They're very common in consequence management or the Department of Defense, but we said, let's look at some tabletop exercises across our different pillars. So we're taking very common scenarios, walking across it, and realizing, when it comes to people, processes, and technologies, that we have different opportunities across each. And some of them are even low-cost solutions that we can implement very quickly. And so we're kind of looking for what things can we implement short term, and then what things do we have to address on a longer term roadmap.
Sounds like a very proactive approach. Thank you for mentioning that. And then another question for you, Amy. Federal agencies obviously have a lot of additional compliance requirements as they approach cybersecurity that, are codified by law, FISMA, et cetera. What concerns do you and your colleagues have about federal zero trust adoption at one end while still ensuring that you're able to, meet these comprehensive so-called check the box security requirements that you also must meet?
So I think that too often we focus on compliance versus risk, and it really needs to be risk-based decisions, talking to the mission owners and really understanding, what steps that they have taken. We're working very closely with our partners over at the Office of Management and Budget, as well as CISA, and discussing different ways that the metrics could be changed in the future to capture a risk-based approach instead of just a binary yes or no. Because in a lot of cases, and I've spoken to many of my counterparts at other agencies where we have operational technology and Internet of Things, it's really not the same level of possibility. So if you have a system, for instance, that's located on top of a mountain, you might not have that same MFA, credentials that you would have on a standard business system. So FISMA works great for business system, is not really what works well for operational technology. So one of the things that we've done is partnered with the Federal CIO Council Innovation Committee, and we are standing up a community of practice for IoT and OT and looking at zero trust and cloud adoption principles. And we'll be developing a guide from that. Working with a lot of our partners, for instance, NASA, they don't have PIV on the Mars rover. I know that might be a surprise, right? So you have to look at, what are the alternate things that you're putting in place, and that people aren't looking at as just, what is the check box, but really what are the things that you're doing to make sure that you've addressed risk.
And then lastly, and kind of doubling back to your comment about your tabletop exercises around the 5 pillars, in addition to those 5 pillars is also those foundational elements for trying to unify automation and visibility and orchestration tools to ultimately get to a more zero trust architecture. Can you talk a little bit about maybe what you learned in those tabletop exercises, and how are you moving forward to, create this underlying foundation for more unified automation?
The unified automation, machine learning is absolutely essential, but the only way that you can get to that is to really understand your processes, and processes have to be repeatable. One of the things that we found was that there was a lot of HR processes when it came around our identity pillar that different people had awareness of that maybe were not as well documented as we like. And then how are we going to incorporate that into our policy decision making and our policy engine? So that's a lot of what we're focused on with these tabletop exercises is, looking at each individual use case. And the next scenario that we're going to be doing is going to be focused around our data pillar. And then how do each of the other pillars interact with that? What are the different policy decision points? How do you do risk scoring? All those good things that came out of the NIST guidance. But I think that a lot of times people are very comfortable with their pillar. But when you look at, how do these things interact? And I know that at least in our department, but also talking to other agencies, there's been a sense that, when it came to the network, the device pillar, identity, things that traditional CISO offices have been dealing with a long time, they're very comfortable. But especially with the data and application pillars, there's a lot of opportunity for growth in those areas, and then for understanding the interaction points between the different pillars. So we're really trying to use these scenario-based opportunities in order to understand it and then to be able to implement it better.
Well, it certainly sounds like you're doing a lot of work in the right direction. So I appreciate your sharing some of that. Amy Hamilton, thank you so much for taking a few minutes to join us today and talk a little bit about what the Department of Energy is doing to move forward with zero trust cybersecurity.